안녕하세요. Today we are reading chapter 25. It's called Matthew Insists on Puffed Sleeves. 네, today's kind of a longer chapter, so I'm going to get started. Matthew was having a bad 10 minutes of it. He had come into the kitchen in the twilight of a cold, gray December evening and had sat down in the woodbox corner to take off his heavy boots, unconscious of the fact that Anne and a bevy of her schoolmates were having a practice of the Fairy Queen in the sitting room. Presently, they came trooping through the hall and out into the kitchen, laughing and chattering gaily. They did not see Matthew, who shrank bashfully back into the shadows beyond the woodbox with a boot in one hand and a bootjack in the other, and he watched them shyly for the aforesaid 10 minutes as they put on caps and jackets and talked about the dialogue and the concert. 네, 지금 앤과 친구들이 지금 얘기를 하고 있는데 매튜가 어디 구석에 있죠. 그런데 이 아이들은 매튜를 못 봤어요. 알리샤님 오늘 일찍 오셨네요. 안녕하세요. 네, 그래서 지금 너무 쑥스러워서 숨고 있어요. Anne stood among them, bright-eyed and animated as they, but Matthew suddenly became conscious that there was something about her different from her mates. 이제 뭔가가 다르다는 걸 느꼈어요. Anne이 친구들과 다른 점이. And what worried Matthew was that the difference impressed him as being something that should not exist. Anne had a brighter face and bigger, starrier eyes and more delicate features than the others. Even shy, unobservant Matthew had learned to take note of these things, but the difference that disturbed him did not consist in any of these respects. Then, in what did it consist? 네, 제이님, 안녕하세요. Okay. So, 뭐가 다르긴 다른데, the difference impressed him as being something that should not exist. 있으면 안 될 차이점이었어요. 왜냐? 앤의 얼굴은 더 밝고 눈은 더 크고 더 반짝이고 delicate features. delicate한 거는 여리여리한 이목구비? 그러니까 투박스럽지 않았다는 거죠. 너무 이목구비도 이쁘고. 그런데 이런 것들이 아니었는데 근데 뭐가 다른지는 알 수가 없는 거예요. Matthew was haunted by this question long after the girls had gone, arm in arm, down the long, hard frozen lane, and Anne had betaken herself to her books. 네, Matthew was haunted by this question. 이 뭐가 다른지 haunted. haunted는 원래 귀신이 나오는 혹은 귀신이 있는 이런 뜻인데 그만큼 불쾌한 생각이 계속 떠올랐다는 거예요. 뭐지? 뭐가 다른 거지? He could not refer to Marilla, who he felt would be quite sure to sniff scornfully and remark that the only difference she saw between Anne and the other girls was that they sometimes kept their tongues quiet, while Anne never did. This, Matthew felt, would be no great help. 네, 왜 Marilla한테 물어볼 수 없었어요? 왜냐하면 Marilla한테 얘기를 했으면 Marilla는 이렇게 얘기를 했을 거예요. 다른 여자애들은 입을 가만히 놔두지 수 있지만 Anne은 한 번도 혀를 가만히 놔두질 않아. 그게 차이점이야. 이렇게 말을 했을 거라는 거죠. He had recourse to his pipe that evening to help him study it out, much to Marilla's disgust. After 2 hours of smoking and hard reflection, Matthew arrived at a solution of his problem. Anne was not dressed like the other girls. 2시간 동안 담배 폈더니 생각 떠올랐어요. 앤은 다른 여자애들처럼 옷을 입지 않았다는 거예요. The more Matthew thought about the matter, the more he was convinced that Anne never had been dressed like the other girls, never since she had come to Green Gables. 한 번도 옷이 똑같은 적이 없었다는 거예요. Marilla had kept her clothed in plain dark dresses, all made after the same unvarying pattern. 항상 평범하고 시커먼 원피스 하고 변함이 없는 패턴으로. If Matthew knew there was such a thing as fashion in dress, it is as much as he did. But he was quite sure that Anne's sleeves did not look at all like the sleeves the other girls wore. 소매가 달랐다는 거 여기가. He recalled the cluster of little girls he had seen around her that evening, all gay in waists of red and blue and pink and white, and he wondered why Marilla always kept her so plainly and soberly gowned. 네, 왜 그렇게 평범하고 진지하게 옷을 입히는지 궁금했습니다. 네, 여기서 soberly는 진지하게란 뜻인데요. 원래 sober의 반대말은 drunk, 술 취한 뜻이죠. 그래서 sober는 되게 정신이 맑은, 그러니까 되게 진지하다는 뜻입니다. Of course, it must be all right. 그래도 괜찮은가 보지. Marilla knew best, and Marilla was bringing her up. Marilla는 제일 잘 알고 Marilla가 키우는 거니까. Probably some wise, inscrutable motive was to be served thereby. 아주 지혜롭고 헤아리기 어렵지만 어떤 좋은 뜻이 있을 거야. But surely it would do no harm to let the child have one pretty dress, something like Diana Barry always wore. 하지만 하나 다이아나 베리 같은 이쁜 원피스 있는 거는 해롭지 않을 거야. Matthew decided that he would give her one. That surely could not be objected to as an unwarranted putting in of his oar. 불필요하게 이 배에 젓는 거를 뭐라 그러죠? oar. 네, 그거를 넣는 거라고 생각을 안 하겠지. 이게 무슨 뜻일까요? Putting in of his oar. 이거 전에 얘기를 하긴 했었어요. 왜 이게 배를 타면 이 배 젓는 거가 몇 개가 있죠? 2개가 있죠. 그런데 한 사람만 이게 져야 이게 잘 갈 수가 있는데 2사람이서 이게 다른 방향으로 하면 이게 어디를 배가 제대로 향할 수가 없죠. 그래서 혼자서 oar를 저을 수 있게 놔뒀는데 자기가 치마 하나 사 준다고 그렇게 putting in of his oar라고 하진 않겠지. 이승만 님 안녕하세요. 아. 클래스 U 수강하고 계시나 봅니다. 네, 감사합니다. Christmas was only a fortnight off. 2주 남았어요, 크리스마스가. A nice new dress would be the very thing for a present. Matthew, with a sigh of satisfaction, put away his pipe and went to bed, while Marilla opened all the doors and aired the house. 냄새 없애려고. The very next evening, Matthew betook himself to Carmody to buy the dress, determined to get the worst over and have done with it. It would be, he felt assured, no trifling ordeal. trifling은 아주 사소한 건데 사소한 일이 아닐 거라는 걸 알고 있었어요. There were some things Matthew could buy and prove himself no mean bargainer. 어떤 것들은 매튜가 혼자서 사고 아주 잘 아무도 자기한테 너무 비싸게 뒤집어 씌우지 않았는데 이 원피스는 자신이 없는 거예요. But he knew he would be at the mercy of shopkeepers when it came to buying a girl's dress. After much cogitation, Matthew resolved to go to Samuel Lawson's store instead of William Blair's. To be sure, the Cuthberts always had gone to William Blair's. It was almost as much a matter of conscience with them as to attend the Presbyterian church and vote conservative. But William Blair's 2 daughters frequently waited on customers there, and Matthew held them in absolute dread. He could contrive to deal with them when he knew exactly what he wanted and could point it out. But in such a matter as this, requiring explanation and consultation, Matthew felt that he must be sure of a man behind the counter. So he would go to Lawson's, where Samuel or his son would wait on him. 네, 아주 많은 생각 후에 어디 가기로 했어요? Samuel Lawson의 가게로 가기로 했어요. 어디 대신? William Blair 가게 대신. 그런데 항상 커트버트들은 Marilla랑 Matthew는 William Blair의 가게를 갔었어요. 그게 얼마나 중요한 일이냐? 장로교회만 가고 보수적으로 투표하는 것만큼 중요한 일이었어요. 하지만 윌리엄 블레어는 누가 도와줘요, 손님들을? 딸들이. waited on customers. 손님을 돌보다. 2 딸들이 손님을 돌보기 때문에 그 딸들은 너무 무서워했어요. 그래서 자기가 뭘 원하는지 딱 알고 들어가면 괜찮지만 그렇지 않으면 자기가 설명해야 되고 막 상담해야 되는 일에는 남자가 필요했던 거예요. 그래서 절대로 안 가는 러슨에 가기로 했습니다. Alas, Matthew did not know that Samuel, in the recent expansion of his business, had set up a lady clerk also. She was a niece of his wife's and a very dashing young person indeed, with a huge drooping pompadour, big rolling brown eyes, and a most extensive and bewildering smile. 네. Samuel가 expansion of his business, 사업이 잘 돼서 여자이라는 사람을 둔 거예요. 그래서 그 조카, 아내의 조카를 고용을 했는데 이 아주 너무 멋지고 젊은 여자였어요. 머리 이렇게 크게 pompadour 하고 She was dressed with exceeding smartness and wore several bangle bracelets that glittered and rattled and tinkled with every movement of her hands. Matthew was covered with confusion at finding her there at all, and those bangles completely wrecked his wits at one fell swoop. 네, 한 방에 이 뱅글 팔찌 때문에 정신이 나갔어요. What can I do for you this evening, Mr. Cuthbert? Miss Lucilla Harris inquired briskly and ingratiatingly, tapping the counter with both hands. 아주 싹싹하게. 어떻게 도와드릴까요? 했어요. Have you any well now, say any garden rakes? 갈퀴 있냐고 물어봤어요. 네. 옷을 사러 온 건데 옷감. Miss Harris looked somewhat surprised, as well as she might, to hear a man inquiring for garden rakes in the middle of December. 조금 놀랐어요. 왜냐? 12월에 누가 갈퀴를 찾는지. I believe we have one or two left over, she said, but they're upstairs in the lumber room. I'll go and see. 있는 것 같은데 가서 볼게요. During her absence, 없는 사이에 Matthew collected his scattered senses for another effort. Scattered는 흩어진 정신을 다시 이제 이렇게 모아 왔어요. Collected, 다시 가지고 왔어요, 정신을. When Miss Harris returned with the rake and cheerfully inquired, "Anything else tonight, Mr. Cuthbert?" Matthew took his courage in both hands, 용기를 두 손으로 모은 다음에, and replied, "Well now, since you suggest it, I might as well buy some hayseed." 어떤 씨앗을 사겠대요, 갑자기. Miss Harris had heard Matthew Cuthbert called odd. 이상하다는 걸 들었어요. She now concluded that he was entirely crazy. 이상하다는 건 들었지만 자기가 직접 보니 아주 미쳤구만. 정신이 나간 사람이라는 걸 알게 됐습니다. We only keep hayseed in the spring, she explained loftily. We've none on hand just now. 봄에만 있어요. 그런 거 지금 없습니다. Oh, certainly, just as you say, stammered unhappy Matthew, seizing the rake and making for the door. 문으로 향했습니다. At the threshold, he recollected that he had not paid for it. 돈을 안 냈다는 걸 알고, and he turned miserably back. 다시 돌아섰어요. While Miss Harris was counting out his change, he rallied his powers for a final desperate attempt. 네, 힘을 이제 아주 마지막 절망적인 시도에 다시 힘을 이제 끌어모았어요. Well now, if it isn't too much trouble, I might as well, that is, I'd like to look at some sugar. 설탕 달래요? White or brown? Queried Miss Harris patiently. Oh, well now, brown, said Matthew feebly. There's a barrel of it over there, said Miss Harris, shaking her bangles at it. It's the only kind we have. I'll take 20 pounds of it, said Matthew, with beads of perspiration standing on his forehead. 네, 거의 10kg를 주문했어요. Matthew had driven halfway home before he was his own man again. 네, 집에 반쯤 운전을 하니까 그때 이제 자기 자신이 됐어요. 정신이 돌아온 거죠. It had been a gruesome experience, but it served him right, he thought, for committing the heresy of going to a strange store. 그렇게 이단적인 일을 하 해서 자기가 이렇게 안 좋은 경험을 했다고 생각을 한 거죠. When he reached home, he hid the rake in the tool house, but the sugar he carried in to Marilla. "Brown sugar!" exclaimed Marilla. "Whatever possessed you to get so much? You know I never use it except for the hired man's porridge or black fruit cake. Jerry's gone, and I've made my cake long ago. It's not good sugar either. It's coarse and dark. William Blair doesn't usually keep sugar like that." I thought it might come in handy sometime, said Matthew, making good his escape. When Matthew came to think the matter over, he decided that a woman was required to cope with the situation. 여자가 필요하다는 것을 깨달았습니다. 레이첼님, 안녕하세요. 네, 아직 this is a long chapter, so we've still got a ways to go. Marilla was out of the question. Marilla는 네, 생각할 수도 없었어요. Matthew felt sure she would throw cold water on his project at once. Remained only Mrs. Lynde, for of no other woman in Avonlea would Matthew have dared to ask advice. 네, Marilla는 cold water on his project, 자기의 프로젝트에 찬물을 던졌을 거기 때문에 남은 사람은 Mrs. Lynde밖에 없었어요. 왜냐? 다른 여자한테는 아무한테도 말을 걸 수가 없었기 때문에 advice. 네, 조언을 얻을 수 있는 여자가 Mrs. Lynde밖에 없었기 때문에. To Mrs. Lynde he went accordingly, and that good lady promptly took the matter out of the harassed man's hands. "Pick out a dress for you to give Anne? To be sure I will. I'm going to Carmody tomorrow, and I'll attend to it. Have you something particular in mind? No? Well, I'll just go by my own judgment then. I believe a nice rich brown would just suit Anne, and William Blair has some new Gloria in that's real pretty. Perhaps you'd like me to make it up for her too, seeing that if Marilla was to make it, Anne would probably get wind of it before the time and spoil the surprise? Well, I'll do it. No, it isn't a mite of trouble. I like sewing. I'll make it to fit my niece, Jenny Gillis, for she and Anne are as like as two peas as far as figure goes." 아, 내가 어차피 카멜이 가니까 내가 할게. 그리고 내가 알아서 고르고 그리고 어차피 Marilla가 만들면 Anne이 wind of it, get wind of it. 알아차릴 수 있으니까 내가 만들게. 네, 그때는 그냥 이렇게 옷을 쇼핑몰에 가 가지고 고를 수 있는 때가 아니었죠. 이 원단을 사 가지고 자기가 자르고 꼬매고 했었어야 됐어요. 네. 로미님 어서 오세요. 브라운 슈거. 네, 근데 10 킬로나 주문을 했기 때문에 마티한테 물어보시면 되겠습니다. 아, 선생님 안녕하세요. 와우. 반갑습니다. alright. 그래서 원래는 Marilla한테 내가 천을 사면 Marilla에게 만들려고 하면 Marilla는 어떻게 했을까요? 네. 아주 실용적인 옷을 만들었을 거기 때문에 핑계를 대고 Anne이 알아차릴까 봐 "내가 만들게." 한 거예요. 그쵸? 너무 친절한 거죠. "Well now, I'm much obliged," said Matthew, "and I don't know, but I think they make the sleeves different nowadays to what they used to be. If it wouldn't be asking too much, I'd like them made in the new way." 요즘 유행하는 방식으로 만들어 줬으면 좋겠어요. "Puffs? Of course. You needn't worry a speck more about it, Matthew. I'll make it up in the very latest fashion. 최신 유행으로 내가 만들어 줄게." To herself, she added when Matthew had gone, 혼잣말로, "It'll be a real satisfaction to see that poor child wearing something decent for once. The way Marilla dresses her is positively ridiculous, that's what, and I've ached to tell her so plainly a dozen times. I've held my tongue, though, for I can see Marilla doesn't want advice, and she thinks she knows more about bringing children up than I do, for all she's an old maid. But that's always the way." 네, 여기까지 읽어볼게요. 아, 정말 그 불쌍한 애가 조금 이쁜 걸 입는 걸 보려면 진짜 너무 내가 기쁘다. 그렇게 입히는 방식이 아주 우스꽝스러워. 내가 어 I've ached to tell her so plainly. 내가 아주 제대로 말해 주고 싶어서 항상 내가 너무 싶었는데 I've held my tongue. 내가 참았지. 왜냐? For I can see Marilla doesn't want advice. 조언 원하지 않고 그리고 나보다 자기는 노처녀면서 나보다 애들을 더 잘 키운다고 생각을 하니까. But that's always the way. Folks that has brought up children know that there's no hard and fast method in the world that'll suit every child. 애들 키워본 사람은 모든 애에게 맞는 법이 없다는 거를 알지. 애들마다 다 다르다는 거죠. 다 다르게 키워야 된다는 거. But them as never have think it's all as plain and easy as rule of three. Just set your three terms down so fashion and the sum will work out correct. 안 키워본 사람은 아주 쉬운 줄 알지? 아주 세 가지 규칙만 알려주고 지키라 그러면은 sum 더하기 그 답이 제대로 나올 거라고 생각하지. But flesh and blood don't come under the head of arithmetic, and that's where Marilla Cuthbert makes your mistake. 하지만 flesh and blood 인간은 산수와 다르다. 수학과 다르지. I suppose she's trying to cultivate a spirit of humility in Anne by dressing her as she does, but it's more likely to cultivate envy and discontent. 겸손을 키우려고 하나 보는데 앤을 그렇게 했다가는 그냥 부러움과 불만만 키우는 거야. I'm sure the child must feel the difference between her clothes and the other girls. But to think of Matthew taking notice of it. 하지만 Matthew가 그거를 알아봤다니. That man is waking up after being asleep for over 60 years. 60년 동안 잠자고 있었는데 이제 깨어난 느낌이네. Marilla knew all the following fortnight that Matthew had something on his mind, but what it was she could not guess until Christmas Eve when Mrs. Lynde brought up the new dress. Marilla behaved pretty well on the whole, although it is very likely she distrusted Mrs. Lynde's diplomatic explanation that she had made the dress because Matthew was afraid Anne would find out about it too soon if Marilla made it. 네, Mrs. Lynde의 아주 외교적인 설명을 믿지 않았다는 거예요. 자기가 안 만들었더라면 Annie 알아차렸을까 봐. So this is what Matthew has been looking so mysterious over and grinning about to himself for 2 weeks, is it? She said a little stiffly but tolerantly. I knew he was up to some foolishness. Well, I must say, I don't think Anne needed any more dresses. 이제 원피스 이제 더 이상 안 필요했는데. I made her 3 good, warm, serviceable ones this fall, and anything more is sheer extravagance. 내가 3개나 따뜻하고 좋은 거 만들어줬는데 그 이상은 사치지. There's enough material in those sleeves alone to make a waist, I declare there is. 그 슬리브만으로 이 재료가 허리를 만드는 만큼 있구만. You'll just pamper Anne's vanity, Matthew, and she's as vain as a peacock now. Well, I hope she'll be satisfied at last, for I know she's been hankering after these silly sleeves ever since they came in, although she never said a word after the first. 엄청 원했다는 거 내가 알아. 그때 한 번 말하고 그 다음은 다시는 말을 안 하긴 했지만. The puffs have been getting bigger and more ridiculous right along. 해마다 이 소매가 더 커지고 있어. They're as big as balloons now. 풍선만큼 커요. Next year, anybody who wears them will have to go through a door sideways. 내년에는 그거 입는 사람은 문 이렇게 지나갈 때 옆으로 지나가야 될 거래요. Christmas morning broke on a beautiful white world. It had been a very mild December, and people had looked forward to a green Christmas. But just enough snow fell softly in the night to transfigure Avonlea. Anne peeped out from her frosted gable window with delighted eyes. The firs in the haunted wood were all feathery and wonderful. The birches and wild cherry trees were outlined in pearl. The plowed fields were stretches of snowy dimples, and there was a crisp tang in the air that was glorious. Anne ran downstairs, singing until her voice re-echoed through Green Gables. Merry Christmas, Marilla! Merry Christmas, Matthew! Isn't it a lovely Christmas? I'm so glad it's white. Any other kind of Christmas doesn't seem real, does it? I don't like green Christmases. They're not green. They're just nasty, faded browns and grays. What makes people call them green? Why? Why? Matthew, is that for me? Oh, Matthew! 네, 여기서 why 하는 거는 왜 이게 아니라 어머 이런 느낌이죠. Matthew had sheepishly unfolded the dress from its paper swathings and held it out with a deprecatory glance at Marilla, who feigned to be contemptuously filling the teapot, but nevertheless watched the scene out of the corner of her eye with a rather interested air. 네, 안 보는 척하지만 네, 한눈으로 이렇게 보고 있었어요. Anne took the dress and looked at it in reverent silence. Oh, how pretty it was! A lovely, soft brown Gloria with all the gloss of silk. A skirt with dainty frills and shirrings, a waist elaborately pin-tucked in the most fashionable way, with a little ruffle of filmy lace at the neck. But the sleeves, they were the crowning glory, long elbow cuffs, and above them, two beautiful puffs divided by rows of shirring and bows of brown silk ribbon. That's a Christmas present for you, Anne, said Matthew shyly. Why, Anne, don't you like it? 왜, 싫어? Well now. For Anne's eyes had suddenly filled with tears. Like it? Oh, Matthew! Anne laid the dress over a chair and clasped her hands. Matthew, it's perfectly exquisite. Oh, I can never thank you enough. Look at those sleeves. Oh, it seems to me this must be a happy dream. It's perfectly exquisite. exquisite는 네, 정교한이란 뜻도 되지만 아주 아름다우면서 정교한인 것 같아요. 정교한 뜻을 제가 잘 모르나? 그쵸. 저희가 처음 읽을 때 막 울었잖아요. 너무 감동적이라 가지고. Well, let us have breakfast, interrupted Marilla. I must say, Anne, I don't think you needed the dress, but since Matthew has got it for you, see that you take good care of it. There's a hair ribbon Mrs. Lynde left for you. It's brown to match the dress. Come now, sit in. 필요는 없었는데, 하지만 마thew가 해줬으니까 가서 잘 돌봐야 돼. 잘 take care of it. 잘 간직하라는 거죠. I don't see how I'm going to eat breakfast, said Anne rapturously. Breakfast seems so commonplace at such an exciting moment. I'd rather feast my eyes on that dress. I'm so glad that puffed sleeves are still fashionable. It did seem to me that I'd never get over it if they went out before I had a dress with them. 이게 무슨 뜻일까요? I'd never get over it if they went out before I had a dress with them. I'd never get over it. 나는 절대로 넘어갈 수 없었을 거다. 너무 속상해서. 왜? 어떻게 했더라면 if they went out. 어딜 나가요? 유행이 이제 끝났으면. 내가 드레스를 그 소매를 가진 드레스를 가지기 전에 유행이 없어졌더라면 자기는 정말 너무 속상했을 거라는 거죠. I'd never have felt quite satisfied, you see. It was lovely of Mrs. Lynde to give me the ribbon, too. I feel that I ought to be a very good girl indeed. It's at times like this I'm sorry I'm not a model little girl, and I always resolve that I will be in future. But somehow it's hard to carry out your resolutions when irresistible temptations come. Still, I really will make an extra effort after this. When the commonplace breakfast was over, Diana appeared, crossing the white log bridge in the hollow, a gay little figure in her crimson ulster. 네, ulster라고는 제가 못 들어봤어요. 그래서 찾아봤더니 막 딴 게 나오더라고요. But 알 수 있는 거는 crimson ulster 하면 뉘앙스로 네, 옷이라는 걸 알 수 있죠. 네, 여기서는 코트입니다. cape 같은 coat. Anne flew down the slope to meet her. Merry Christmas, Diana! And oh, it's a wonderful Christmas. I've something splendid to show you. Matthew has given me the loveliest dress with such sleeves. I couldn't even imagine any nicer. I've got something more for you, said Diana breathlessly. Here, this box. Aunt Josephine sent us out a big box with ever so many things in it, and this is for you. I'd have brought it over last night, but it didn't come until after dark, and I never feel comfortable And I never feel very comfortable coming through the haunted wood in the dark now. Anne opened the box and peeped in. First, a card with "For the Anne girl and Merry Christmas" written on it, and then a pair of the daintiest little kid slippers with beaded toes and satin bows and glistening buckles. "Oh," said Anne, "Diana, this is too much. I must be dreaming." 네, 뭘 줬죠? 너무 이쁜 구두, 슬리퍼. I call it providential. 천우신조의? 네, 너무 좋은 때였다는 거예요. Said Diana. You won't have to borrow Ruby's slippers now, and that's a blessing, for they're 2 sizes too big for you, and it would be awful to hear a fairy shuffling. fairy가 내 신발을 끄는 소리, 신발을 끌면 정말 안 좋을 거야. Josie Pye would be delighted. Mind you, Rob Wright went home with Gertie Pye from the practice night before last. From the practice night before last. Did you ever hear anything equal to that? All the Avonlea scholars were in a fever of excitement that day, for the hall had to be decorated and a last grand rehearsal held. The concert came off in the evening and was a pronounced success. The little hall was crowded. All the performers did excellently well, but Anne was the bright particular star of the occasion, as even envy, in the shape of Josie Pye, dared not deny. 네, 이 날의 스타는 Anne이었죠. Oh, hasn't it been a brilliant evening? Sighed Anne when it was all over, and she and Diana were walking home together under a dark, starry sky. Everything went off very well, said Diana practically. I guess we must have made as much as $10. 10달러 번 것 같아. Mind you, Mr. Allen is going to send an account of it to the Charlottetown papers. Oh, Diana, will we really see our names in print? It makes me thrilled to think of it. 우리 이름들이 신문에 나올 거야? Your solo was perfectly elegant, Diana. I felt prouder than you did when it was encored. I just said to myself, it is my dear bosom friend who is so honored. Well, your recitations just brought down the house, Anne. That sad one was simply splendid. Oh, I was so nervous, Diana. When Mr. Allen called out my name, I really cannot tell how I ever got up on that platform. I felt as if a million eyes were looking at me and through me, and for one dreadful moment I was sure I couldn't begin at all. Then I thought of my lovely puffed sleeves and took courage. 나의 이 퍼프 소매를 생각하고 용기를 냈어. I knew that I must live up to those sleeves, Diana. 소매에 부끄럽지 않게 내가 해야 된다는 걸 알았지. So I started in, and my voice seemed to be coming from ever so far away. I just felt like a parrot. It's providential that I practiced these recitations so often up in the garret, or I'd never have been able to get through. Did I groan all right? 신음소리 낼 때 잘했어? Yes, indeed, you groaned lovely, assured Diana. I saw old Mrs. Sloane wiping away tears when I sat down. It was splendid to think I had touched somebody's heart. It's so romantic to take part in a concert, isn't it? Oh, it's been a very memorable occasion indeed. Wasn't the boys' dialogue fine? 남자들의 대화 너무 좋았지? Gilbert Blythe was just splendid, Anne. I do think it's awful mean the way you treat Gil. Gilbert한테 하는 거 조금 너무 못된 것 같아. Wait till I tell you. When you ran off the platform after the fairy dialogue, one of your roses fell out of your hair. 무대 끝나고 나서 무대에 내려갈 때 머리에 있던 장미가 하나 떨어졌어. I saw Gil pick it up and put it in his breast pocket. Gilbert가 그걸 주워서 가슴 주머니에 넣는 걸 내가 봤어. There now. You're so romantic that I'm sure you ought to be pleased at that. 너는 너무 하도 낭만적이니까 그런 거 듣기 좋지? It's nothing to me what that person does, said Anne loftily. 나한텐 아무런 상관이 없어, 관계가 없어. I simply never waste a thought on him, Diana. 나는 그에게 생각하는데 시간을 낭비하지 않아. That night, Marilla and Matthew, who had been out to a concert for the first time in 20 years, sat for a while by the kitchen fire after Anne had gone to bed. Well, now, I guess our Anne did as well as any of them, said Matthew proudly. Annie 다른 애들만큼 잘했지? Yes, she did, admitted Marilla. She's a bright child, Matthew, and she looked real nice too. I've been kind of opposed to this concert scheme, but I suppose there's no real harm in it after all. Anyhow, I was proud of Anne tonight, although I'm not going to tell her so. 내가 앤 오늘 아주 자랑스러웠어. 얘기는 안 해줄 거지만. Well, now, I was proud of her, and I did tell her so before she went upstairs, said Matthew. 아, 나는 자랑스러워서 위층에 올라가기 전에 내가 얘기해 줬지. For 이렇게 써 있죠. Before 했을 때 B를 빼먹어서 여기다가 apostrophe를 넣은 거예요. We must see what we can do for her some of these days, Marilla. 어떻게 해줘야 되는지 생각해 봐야 되겠어. I guess she'll need something more than Avonlea School by and by. 나중에는 Avonlea 이 동네 학교보다 다른 것이 더 필요할 거야. There's time enough to think of that, said Marilla. She's only 13 in March. 3월에 13살 될 거기 때문에 아직 시간이 충분해. 생각할 시간. Though tonight it struck me she was growing quite a big girl. Mrs. Lynde made that dress a mite too long, and it makes Anne look so tall. She's quick to learn, and I guess the best thing we can do for her will be to send her to Queen's after a spell. But nothing need be said about that for a year or two yet. Well, now, it'll do no harm to be thinking it over off and on, said Matthew. Things like that are all the better for lots of thinking over. The end. Ned, thank you for staying with me. Whoa, that was a long chapter. We've got another long chapter next week. 너무 좋았죠, 이번 chapter. 네. 어떠셨나요? 여러분. Thank you, Alicia님. 네, 정기근 선생님, 안녕하세요. 안 주무셨어요? Alright, 다음 주에는 감사합니다, 레이첼님. 저도 너무 I love reading this book. 네, I love to read. 이렇게 좋아해 주시니까 저도 너무 기쁩니다. What gilded 우리 로미님, you're so romantic. 네. 네. 장미가 떨어져서 딱 가슴 주머니에 이렇게 넣었죠. 자기를 거들떠 보지도 않는데. 제이님도 아직 계셨군요. 네. Thank you for coming in and staying. 다음 주는 The Story Club is formed. 요거는 제가 생각이 안 나는데 네, 제가 예습을 잘해서 다음 주에도 준비를 잘해서 읽어 드리겠습니다. 네, 여러분들도 다음 주까지 잘 지내시고 네, 계속 조심하시고 코로나. 네. Good night. Have a great week.